Here's a scary fact about childhood. It turns out that the way your parents interacted with you in the first 3 years of your life deeply impacts your relationship as an adult. These traits, whether you're avoidant, anxious, fearful, or even secure, are attachment strategies that were developed before you even knew how to speak. Now, there are many implications to this. These attachment strategies impact our romantic relationships, how we deal with conflict, and the unmet desires that lead us to believe that something's missing in our lives. In this episode of the Examine Life podcast, I speak with Jess Morey, a meditation teacher and a contemplative coach, on how we can help our partners, children, and friends feel safe, seen, and loved. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Examine Life podcast, where we take some of life's thorniest questions and deconstruct them in a way that is pragmatic and philosophical so that you can lead a more productive, examined, and joyful life. Today, I'm joined by Jess Morey, when we're going to be talking about the question, what is your attachment strategy? How's it going, Jess?
It's going great. Really good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I am excited for this conversation. So before we jump in, give us the brief cliff notes. If no one, you enter a new room and someone says, "Oh, hey," you say, "Hey, I'm Jess." How would you describe yourself?
I would say that I teach meditation, and I'm really interested in the application of meditative skills and tools, and contemplative skills and tools towards personal healing and transformation for the purpose of shifting the ways that we show up in the world so that we stop being on a suicidal track as a human species.
There's a lot. That's quite a distilled. That's quite a distilled mission statement. So
Yeah.
I would the podcast is called the Examine Life podcast. But when you, even for my own edification, when you say contemplative practices, or that's on, you said contemplative something.
Yeah.
How do you explain that to a layperson? They're like, what do you mean by that?
Right. So contemplative practice, actually, that is like a catch-all. There's a lot that can go under that, and that come from a lot of different religious traditions and non-religious traditions. So to be more specific, my primary training is in Buddhism and primarily early Buddhist meditation. So that's like the Theravadan insight tradition is my primary training. And really what we know is the mindfulness movement today is coming out of that training primarily. So if you're familiar with mindfulness, it's similar, but also there's more that comes from Buddhism. And then I have some training in Tibetan or Vajrayana tantric practices, and have done a lot of body-based work like somatic experiencing and yoga. And so integrating a more somatic and body-based practice to primarily Buddhist mind training.
Got it. And when you say contemplative, I'm hearing a lot of different types of meditative practices. How much of it, you mentioned obviously a deep through line connection to Buddhism. How much of that contemplation is related to like texts and scriptures and things like the Bhagavad Gita, or how much of it is like actual? Because in my mind, and I'm very much a pedestrian, a tourist in this. It's like contemplative. What I hear is like, I almost hear like philosophy, and then a meditation is like stillness, quietness, and then I kind of create this probably very incorrect duality. But
that's so. Well, it's just really interesting for me to hear how you hear it or the way that you perceive it. Primarily, it's actual meditation, and meditation isn't necessarily stillness. Just to be clear, like we can unpack that a little bit, but it's not. It's not very much philosophical or scriptural. For me personally, any kind of like reading, study in scripture, I read that as like a how-to manual. To me, it's just like, in a very pragmatic way, it's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Let me go now to my meditation cushion and look at my own mind, feel in my own body, like what's true, how do I access that? I see it, more as like a map, direction, like where you're gonna go, or a recipe book. So let's go cook, not just to like think about the recipe.
Got it. So meditation is the cooking and the scriptures are the recipes in that analogy. And how important is there, I hate to quantify all these things, so that's where my mind goes. Is there like a ratio where it's like 80% cooking, 20% recipes?
Yeah. Well, it's pretty interesting because
way?
my earliest practice, like the Insight tradition and the way that it came to the West from places like Burma, Sri Lanka, Thailand, the Western convert teachers really taught it as like just cooking. I would say almost like only cooking. You go on retreat and they just give you an instruction, you do it. And you're not even supposed to read on retreat. So there's no reading. You don't have like your own relationship with the scripture. You just do the instruction. So that was my earliest experience with practice for many, many years. And it actually wasn't until I started diving a little bit more into Tibetan tradition that I got more interested in the study aspect, because the Tibetan tradition has an explicit element of like, there's the practice and there's the study, and those go hand in hand. And so it might be more like 30% study and 70% practice.
Got it.
But most of my practice life was like 100% practice. And
got it.
Then more recently, I've been like, oh, well, there's actually these how-to manuals that are pretty interesting, so that you don't have to get the translation just from your teachers. You can go directly to a source and kind of parse it out for yourself and try it out. Yeah.
Fascinating. And what, if you don't mind, if you're open to sharing, what does a meditation practice look like for you today? And just to give you context for our listeners, if I had to guess, they are Headspace, Calm, maybe Sam Harris. They're probably app-based. I'd say maybe 5% of them has more of like a TM type, 20 minutes a day, once a day type thing. I'll give you my own practice is about an hour a day. So 30 minutes.
Wow.
I do, I observe thoughts. So it's like when you see a thought, it's like, I say, thinking, and then kind of like watch. I forget what tradition that's from, but that's my morning meditation. And my evening meditation is counting up to 10, down to 1 on the exhales for half an hour.
Okay. And so when you do the thought, do you engage in any way with the content, or you're just thinking and then watch what happens to it?
I was taught to just label, like observe that it's there, and then just eventually it dissolves, and then another thought will come up 5 seconds later, 15 seconds later. So
and otherwise you're just kind of, your attention is just like in your mind, like where you become aware of thought, and you just like hang out there until you notice a thought arise.
Yeah. Or in my case, there's thoughts all the time, and then you wait for the moment when there's no thoughts.
Okay, cool.
But I would say for the listener group, that's very advanced. I've been doing that for versions of that for a decade. I think our listeners are probably year 4 of an app, 5-10 minutes.
Can I just, before I go into mine, just one question, like why do you do that? Like, what do you get out of it? Why do you do that?
Why? Ooh, great question. So I started with TM about 8 years ago, or 9 years ago. And initially my gateway into TM, for those who are unfamiliar, TM is Transcendental Meditation. It's a mantra-based meditation where you repeat a mantra, it's like a syllable, over and over and over again for 20 minutes twice a day. I'm probably butchering it in meditation speak, but and you kind of watch thoughts come and go, and there's no real engagement with it. You just repeat the mantra. And I found that to be a really powerful gateway to meditation. And I started meditating in maybe the way many of the way our listeners will engage is like I wanted to be less stressed. I wanted to have clearer thinking. There was a benefit that I wanted to get from meditation, and I saw all these other people doing it, and I'm like, well, they're getting the benefit. I want the benefit too. So I did TM for probably 5 years, 40 minutes a day. And then I worked with a non-dualist teacher, and he was he was kind of represented a bunch of different traditions, and so I couldn't even say back what they were. But basically, he was like, "Why don't you try these other meditations?" And I started to try them. He was kind of against TM, and to be honest, I was kind of getting bored of TM by that time. And so he kind of said, "Why don't you try these?" And they were much harder, I guess. And they felt a bit richer in substance. And the reason why I do the counting one in the evening is because my brain is just on fire, and it would be very, very hard to do the thought observation one in the evening. But I think that's not exactly the question you're asking. I think what I found the first couple of years, the first month, it's like being on drugs. I would just sleep for 14 hours. Just some kind of physical shift was happening in my body the first couple months, maybe the first month. Whoa, there's some stuff happening here. Then I noticed that it's hard to tell, but things like patience, negative self-talk, catastrophizing, things that I did a lot of, they just started to feel they didn't have the same grip that they had on me. And so maybe you could say I'm a very, not anxious, because we were going to talk about this later, but I'm a very kind of wound up person, very intense in things that I do. And what TM was doing was just kind of turning the volume down on everything. It just kind of turned the volume down on life. And then it just kind of gave me this just like a lightness to life. And again, it's hard to pinpoint a moment, but there definitely, if I think back, I'm like, oh my God, how did I deal with a really bad thing happening at work before I did this? I can't even imagine it. Then, longer answer, but then there were a few things that I thought would completely knock my world upside down, which was losing loved ones, which is something I've always been terribly afraid of. And specifically how I would cope, in the aftermath of loss and grief. And in that 10-year period, there have been 3 close people in my life who have passed away. And they're kind of almost like a third. And there was just this, it's going to sound weird. It wasn't as bad. It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. Not because the grief was definitely as powerful, and the sense of loss was as powerful as I thought it would be, but kind of the inability to deal with the own ensuing thoughts. And we could get into I think a lot of my fear of death was like a fear of my own ego, my egoic death of God, I don't matter. People aren't going to think about me at some point. I think that's other people dying was bringing that up in me. And again, somehow, and it's hard to tell because I had a big life change. I left corporate. I had many spiritual teachers, life coaches, and so on. I've been meditating for 9+ years. So it's hard to tell, I'm sure all of them worked in unison, but I'll stop there because I answered probably in more detail than you
so
wanted.
rich. Thank you. So maybe just more specific. Now you get up in the morning and you do this thought meditation. Why? What happens? What do you experience today, yesterday?
Yeah. It's gonna sound probably a bit trite, but there is this just coming home to yourself, right? I think you can feel, I almost got a little teary-eyed just saying that. I feel like we are I can be so disconnected from myself through work, through even like whatever. I'm just always doing stuff. And there isn't that true connection, like, hey, like, we're here, we're good, we're alive, you know? And I used to think that it was just like, oh, it's a nice break from all that other stuff. But it's almost like if the way I feel is like, you know how you would nurture a young child and be like, I'm here for you, I care for you, I love you, you're safe. I feel like when I meditate, I do that to myself.
You. All right. Perfect. I'm just saying,
you get what you wanted?
Well, it just connects to so much that I wanted to talk about. But no, I didn't know what you were going to say. It was so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. It's really touching. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to hear.
So I'll circle back.
We'll come back to me. So just so our listeners know, Jess had me fill out. We're going to talk about attachment strategies. Jess had me fill out these questionnaires before. These really detailed questionnaires. We'll probably tie back to this. But I do want to hear about your meditation. As like, what is a meditation? A peer of mine, in some regards. What does your meditation practice look like after you've been doing it since you were a kid? I think.
Yeah, since I was 14, so 30 years now. So, yeah, I also laugh because I have a toddler. He's 21 months old. Which means my meditation practice has just changed radically over the last 21 months to basically I meditate when I wake up before he does. That's when I meditate, basically. And I aim for, if I can, I get, whatever amount of time I have, but maybe 20 minutes is like, because then it's also the debate of like, I could also get some exercise right now.
That's good.
So my meditation looks like that. It's like 20 minutes in the morning before, if I wake up before he does.
Yeah.
I can also talk about how I meditated in the like early postpartum days. That was more like meditating when we were nursing. I did a lot of nursing meditation practice.
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
And what do you have a style? Or I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
I
feel
like,
doing.
Just so the audience knows that, like, it would imagine like LeBron James and like you barely know, like you're a spectator at basketball and you're like, so what kind of drills do you do when you practice? Like, do you do that like dribbling thing between your like that's what I feel like asking a meditation teacher, like, what's your style?
Yeah. Well, what's great is like, I hope, and I think probably it's like a lot more accessible, but we'll see, than LeBron James. So what I'll say is that it really depends. Like, I'm tracking that day. Like, what do I need today is sort of how I orient. And then I'll practice based on that. It could say there's like two major categories, which are like the more like loving kindness, actively cultivating a self-compassion or compassion practice, or a practice that's more concentration awareness. So, and I would say TM, and I know TM people don't necessarily agree with this, but I see TM as basic, it has a concentration aspect. It's really like a concentration practice where you're just focusing on a kind of primary object, and the mind, it's beautiful. Like the mind, it is like once we develop that skill, it's like going to the spa for your mind. It can be one of the most relaxing and just like deeply restful, pleasant experiences. And it's like good. It's really good for the mind. It has all these positive benefits. And also what you're doing in the evening of like the breath counting is like as a concentration practice. It's just like a way to take care of our minds. And it's healthy for them. It feels good for the mind body. It's settling, all these things. So the third kind of practice you could think about is an insight practice, which you might have heard the word, or people might have heard the word Vipassana meditation, that translates as clear seeing or insight. And so that's where you're looking at the nature of your thoughts, for example. So probably what you're doing in the morning is some kind of insight practice
Insight.
that
Got it.
you're looking at the nature of experience and seeing what's true about it. For example, with your thoughts, you're seeing that they're impermanent. They come and go by themselves. You don't have to do anything about it. So they're kind of impersonal. You don't have to believe them. Like they happen by themselves. Like you don't have to react to them. So there's like just a ton of wisdom that occurs in insight just by doing what you're doing. Just what is a thought and not being like caught in it and then racing off on it. So those are kind of 3 categories of practice.
Got it. So loving kindness, concentration, and insight.
Yep.
Are kind of 3 loose habits. Oh, really?
Categories.
Really powerful. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm sure we'll circle back to all this. So let's dive in. Before we jump into the question, which is what's your attachment strategy? And Jess will tie it all together for us. If you're interested in joining one of our upcoming group coaching programs, check out radreads.co/coaching. So what's your attachment strategy? Let's just maybe people are like, wait, you guys are talking about meditation, but where the topic is about attachment strategy, I'm sure you're going to draw us a very clear line between the two, and maybe I'll interject myself in between. But tell us what is attachment theory and how you got into it, and why is it relevant to the conversation we're having?
Yeah, great. This is my current favorite topic, so I'm so excited. The challenge for me is going to be you might have to slow me down. I'll have to pause and take some breaths. So attachment theory is a theory that came in the 1900s. It was developed in the 1900s. And the idea is that mammals specifically, and then humans very much so, when we're born, need to stay very close to adult mammals. So to protect us. So otherwise we'd die. Totally makes sense. Fawns, cubs, humans. And so what attachment theory is, behaviors that adults and infants engage to stay close to each other, for the infant to stay close to the adult to be taken care of. And so that's one aspect of attachment. And then the other aspect is like part of what happens is if the infant is successful at that in the relationship of staying close and being cared for and safe with the adult, then they feel safe enough to explore the environment. So there's both the closeness and the exploratory aspects of attachment. So if you feel, and it just makes a ton of sense, like if you feel like that caregiver is paying attention to you, they care about you, they're oriented to you, then you can go off and explore and they'll protect you if like you're going to get into danger. Or if you do get into danger, you can run back and get taken care of or soothed by the adult caregiver. So that's a kind of one way of talking about the theory.
Got it. And what age, if we're talking about human mammals, what are there specific kind of break points? My wife always quotes this thing that like if something happens after a child's 7, it's like they're all she says like all their neural pathways are formed or something happens at 7. But what are the like milestones of
so for specifically for attachment, that is laid down. So basically the patterns that the infant is developing are laid down usually by about 3 years old. So that's the attachment system. And then there are other relational systems that develop and patterns after that in like early childhood. And we were thinking like up to 7. But that particular attachment patterning, which has a lot of impacts about then how we relate to other humans for the rest of our lives and our expectations in relationship. So how we act and our expectations, and also what we think about ourselves. But what's really challenging, what is really challenging
and
about attachment,
how many years was that? I missed
the first 3 years. The first 3 years.
So before you're barely speaking.
Yeah, exactly. You're barely speaking. And this is what's so challenging about it is that these like behavioral, emotional, like almost subverbal patterns get laid down before we have like narrative memory, before we have cognitive, like verbal memory.
Hmm.
So it's implicit, it's behavioral, it's emotional, it's somatic. So when this is what it's so that one, it makes it really hard to understand. Like, say you keep getting the same kinds of relationship dilemmas and just like over and over and over again, you can't figure it out. It could very well be because there's this implicit, unconscious, very early patterning about relationships that you don't even know is happening because it's pre-verbal.
Got it.
Yeah, and then also what
Wow.
makes it so challenging is that it's very hard to fix or address or shift through talk therapy because it's not at the verbal level. It's in the body.
Yeah.
It's in this like unconscious memory. And
Got
this is where
it.
the meditation piece comes in. So
I see.
basically I'll go on this thread. My meditation teacher, who's a Tibetan teacher, Dr. Dan Brown, was also a psychologist and a researcher who focused on trauma and early childhood trauma. And he's kind of like the most interesting man in the world, like in terms of all the things that he did. But he was really involved in a lot of priest abuse cases as an expert witness, and also in Serbia and war tribunal cases as an expert witness around trauma and abuse and recovered memory and all these kinds of things. But also a just profound meditation teacher and translated tons of Tibetan texts. He developed a meditative technique to heal early attachment wounding. So if we develop unuseful strategies, and we can talk about like the patterns of those, he developed this meditation technique to shift those. And the reason why he's working at that subverbal, visceral, implicit, somatic, emotional level, that meditation can go there in a way that, like, and it's with a lot of imagination and feeling in a way that talk therapy doesn't get in there.
Yeah.
So,
Wow. All right. So thank you for that. There's so much there. When we first met and talked about attachment styles, I felt like when I hear attachment, I hear like dating advice is it's like, meaning like, I can't, like talking from a man's heterosexual man, like, I have a friend who always is like, has like a savior type, plays a savior role in relationships and looks to find like people wounded partners and like wants to heal them and take care of them and all that. And so I'm like, maybe that's this friend's version attachment. Like he has a certain attachment style or strategy. Just to play out this example is if I'm hearing correctly, like if that is a style or a strategy, is that it's possible that some of that was formed in his first 3 years of his life.
Yeah, totally. And the one thing that I want to say, so we originally talked about, do we use this word attachment style or attachment strategy? And people are probably most familiar with attachment style. And because there's like tons of quizzes, there's like pop quizzes, there's a Cosmo quiz where you can get your attachment style. Just to know that the self-report quizzes are like notoriously poor at actually identifying your attachment style. The way that it's best done, like there's this long interview process, and it's not about what you say, it's about how you talk about it that's scored and assessed in this really subtle way. So, and then when I'm more recently been learning about and working with students is like a Rorschach test. It's these images, and then you tell stories about it. And so that's getting into your subconscious, to the imaginal world, basically like your beliefs and frameworks about the world. You basically reveal them by telling stories about images.
Wow.
So I just want to say, and that's one piece that often you can answer questions to a quiz in a way that doesn't actually really reveal the depth of what's happening.
Yep.
And the other thing that I want to say about style, there's like 4 main categories that people talk about, like secure, And then there's 3 types of insecure: avoidant, anxious, disorganized. Happy to like kind of go into some of those, but that makes it feel like, you know, you're one of 4 things, you know, and everyone's like that kind of like when we put it in the styles.
Yes.
And there's so much more nuance, like so much more complexity and nuance within each one of those patterns. And then the way that we relate, like as infants, like many of us, you know, for our hetero parents, we had like a mom and a dad and like maybe a nanny or a babysitter, like, or grandparent. And so you can have a different attachment pattern with each of those people. And so then depending on what the nature of the relationship is, or some of the qualities of that person, you could act differently. You could turn on the attachment pattern that you had with your dad or your mom, your grandfather. So it has more complexity. Like some parts of us might be kind of secure, but then in these kinds of dynamics, we go into this more avoidant pattern. So I just I want people to know the complexity and not just think they have to find their category and then they're in that. So that's,
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. And if you go back to that first couple year period, because this still kind of, as a parent, I'm like, oh my God, my kids are 9 and 7. I'm retracing my steps from, you know, I'm like, did I do this? Did I do that? Sleep training, like, you know, all these things are like flashing through my mind as you're saying that. Is it fruitful to say kind of in that 0 to 3 phase, there are ways that the caregiver interacts, like kind of buckets? Like obviously there's probably like a trauma, and the trauma bucket's probably quite large and also its own bucket.
Yes.
How would you, what are
totally. So there is very clear. So the first thing I want to say for parents is that the research is pretty clear that you only have to be basically attuned in doing and embodying these qualities I'm going to describe 30% of the time. 30% of the time. If you get 30%, you're good. Your kid, that's like good enough parenting. And so often that's the phrase that's used, is good enough. Who's the good enough mother, the good enough father, the good enough parent, or caregiver. So you only have to be good enough, and the research points to 30% of the time, which hopefully is doable. And I'm imagining if you're listening to this podcast, you could do that. 30%. So what those qualities are, there's like just sort of like underlying qualities to be consistent and present and reliable. So those are like just your consistent, present, reliable. Those are kind of primary like underlying factors. And then there are 5 behavioral factors. So 5 ways to be. And as you listen to this, if you're a parent, you can think of it as a parent, but also it's like the same qualities in a relationship, like any kind of relationship, right? So the first, or an intimate relationship, the first is fiercely protective. Like, so you're protecting that. And that's really the primary function of the attachment relationship, is to protect child. So you're protecting them. The second is that you're attuned, so that you're interested in and trying to understand the experience of the infant or child. And they're like, in that attunement is like, what are they feeling? What might they be thinking? Like wondering about what's going on for them and tracking like their emotional states. The third is soothing and reassurance. So, and that really includes a lot of physical touch. So when they're crying, holding them, comforting them. Soothing and reassuring is the third. The fourth is expressed delight. And this is one of my favorite in this. And this could be 5. And so expressed delight is the taking joy in parenting, taking joy in your child and expressing that joy to them. So shifting as much as possible out of the task of parenting into the joy of it. And the joy of that is also taking joy in just the child's being, not as so much in like what they achieve or what they do, but just in who they are.
Wow.
And that one's so wonderful because there's some theory and some research backing this up that like that's the foundation, or my teacher talked about that is the foundation of self-esteem. Because from 0 to 3 is when our I, the sense of me, of Jess, is arising, each one of us. So as my sense of me and Jess arises, it starts to get embedded with joy, with these like positive affects, because we see that in our parents when they look at me. So me brings joy. And so then the idea is that like when you think about me, which is, if you're a meditator, it's like a lot of the time with that thinking about me would arise positive feelings. So that's which is a definition of self-esteem. And then the final one, the 5th, is championing your child's self-development or encouragement for exploration. And so this is really like tracking what they're into, what they're excited by, and supporting that, helping them to go out and explore the world.
Can I just say I have like crazy goosebumps because it's almost like you just like distilled the essence of parenting into like a 5-step, and each one of them is you did a beautiful job of. I'm like almost have tears in my eyes. It's like beautiful job of the texture of it. It's like you didn't just say like it's a word, you added this beautiful scaffolding and color and context to the word. And the thing that I'm also seeing as I'm just rereading this list on my notes is like, I'm like, grown-ups need that. Like,
yes.
It's funny because we used to go, my wife and I, we would go see a child therapist. And I've said this story on another podcast, but it was PCIT, parent-child interaction therapy. Which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that modality. But a lot of it is, especially like 3, 4, and 5, just kind of showing your child this, like the joy and express delight and championing and all that. And you just did for 5 minutes a day during like a preset playing time. And it worked wonders for our child, who was 4 when we did it at the time. But we would always leave the sessions with a therapist. And my wife, Lisa, she's like, I need you to do that to me.
Yeah.
And it's funny, the more I read, because I've read a lot of these like child therapy books and blogs and resources. And I read them, I'm like, every time I read them, I'm like, grown-ups need this too. Like grown-ups need to feel protected, need to feel attuned, need to be soothed, need to express delight, and need to be championed. I'm like, we need that so badly.
Yeah, completely. I mean, so much. So one thing to say is that like there is something called secure intimacy practice, like, so that I'll talk about, and it's the same qualities, and imagining yourself offering that to a partner and receiving that from a partner. But I also want to say it's like what you said, the way you described your morning meditation and how you feel. It's that. It's like you are offering that to yourself in that way. That nurturing and caring for a child.
Yeah. And you said before there were like reliability, there was like another list before you went into these 5. Reliability, presence.
So those are kind of like the foundational qualities, which are being present. And the presence is not just physical presence, but attentional presence. So, and this is where, it really is problematic to be on our phones around our kids, like multitasking. And that's like, this is where I find it so challenging. I'm like, I gotta like pack your lunch and like clean the dishes and stuff like that. I am going to be doing these other things. So that's where it's helpful to have the 30% awareness. And then, but I really try to track like, could I include my son in when I'm making my tea in the morning and talk to him and tell him what I'm doing, or in the in the dishes. So there's just ways that I try to think about having some attention with him even as I'm doing other things.
Mm-hmm.
But I really do try to be super careful about being on my phone around him, because that's
Yeah.
like a really clear, there's a ton of research around the negative impact that can have.
Well, my girls even notice, they're like, Dad, you're in robot mode, because I'll be with them and
Mhm.
I start thinking about a work thing or and then something about my eyes changes, and they just like, even my 6-year-old, Dad's in robot mode. They call it robot
Yeah.
mode.
Oh, that's great. There's actually, if you look, there's a lot of research. There's something called the still face research. Have you heard of this?
No, I haven't.
It's, and I think you can Google and watch a video. It says for 2 minutes, a mother went into still face. So just totally, like, basically robot mode is probably
Robot
what you're
mode.
doing.
Oh, wow.
Disconnected, right? A little dissociated because you're just in your thoughts.
Yeah.
And the infant's reaction, I mean, by 2 minutes, it's like screaming. Like, that's like
Wow.
such the primary thing. It needs the caregiver to notice what's happening and see what they're doing, or else they could die. And so you can see the agitation in an infant with just 2 minutes of still face.
Oh my
So,
God.
yeah.
I like, it's so funny because as you say it, it's like, it's so easy. It looks so easy and it looks so impossible at the same time,
Yeah.
But thank you for the
yeah.
30%.
Yeah, that's like super important. And so it's presence, and then the other qualities are being consistent and reliable. So yeah, so that there's a sense that like you can be relied on. You're gonna be there. Like, that's what gives a sense of safety. So consistent, reliable.
Got it.
And what I love about that framework of those 3 qualities, and then the 5 behaviors, are super aligned with mindfulness meditation. Like, it's what we develop in mindfulness meditation, and then in these heart practices, like in concentration and loving kindness. Like, concentration, you could say, is like a consistency practice. It's like, how do you develop the ability to be present over consistently, reliably, to keep coming back, to bring your attention where you want it to be. And then presence is just that mindfulness. Like, I'm here. I'm not gone.
Yeah.
Like, we're really developing those skills in our meditation practice. And then the other behavioral qualities are really connected to these heart qualities of compassion, the soothing, of empathetic joy, of equanimity. So yeah, there's a real correlation for me between what we are directly developing in our meditation to express outward, but also expressing inward, to have these secure behaviors.
It's funny. I always say it's funny, I'm noticing, but it's interesting because as you're talking, a lot of what I don't hear it as inwards. It's always like outwards, right? And it's probably, you could probably, based on some of the stuff I've shared, it probably makes more sense. But I think of it, and you asked me earlier, like, why do you meditate? And one of the things I notice is I'm way more patient. And so that consistency of practice just enables this amount of patience that is now just like such a gift. And then I'm looking at the list. I'm like, oh, I can do many of these things because I'm patient and present, right? And so like I just for our listeners, like it's like, yes, you meditate and there's this practice and it's hard to know. I think people who are listening are like, I don't know if I get all this. I don't know if it's working, right?
Yeah, totally.
And then they give up, And so, but to hear you describe this, I'm like, oh man, I'm doing okay in these categories, except for robot face, because in part because of my meditative practice.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And even you say outward and inward, it's like, this is where things get more like, I don't know, philosophical or something, but not just the deeper end of practice, where what's happening is we're connecting with our awareness. And I would propose that these qualities are innate to our awareness. And awareness is not, it doesn't make a distinction between inner and outer. There's a way that we can start to practice, and we see it's all because all of it is in our awareness. It's all in our mind. Like this distinct, we are making a distinction between inner and outer. Like,
Yeah.
and so there's a truth to that in a relative way, but in an ultimate way, when we connect with awareness and strengthen our connection to that and pervasive identification with it, we're in those qualities. And so those qualities are going to relate to our inner experience, our own thoughts and emotions and patterns with that, as well as with our kids, our beloved ones, our partners.
Yeah. Is that a reason? Is that like an example of non-dualism in what you just described, where it's not like in or out? It's just it just is, or it's just awareness, right? It's not inner awareness or outer awareness.
Yeah, because and there's a way when like I realize like it feels, it feels inner and outer because like I look out there and then I can't look in here. So there's ways that things are structured, our perception, so that it feels inner and outer. But then there's a way that you can suddenly be like, it's so obvious because things only exist in my experience is it only exists in my awareness.
Yeah.
You and our conversation are in awareness. Like there's nowhere else it can be. Because awareness is like how we become conscious.
Yeah.
Of anything. So there's a necessity of that. That's hard. I hope that's like making some sense.
No, I've been in the world long enough to kind of grasp what you're saying, but I think it also shows the importance of meditation, because you can't always use words to explain the thing that you're trying to explain, right? And I think that that will be something very hard for our listeners to grok at this moment. That like, what do you mean you can't explain it with words? And but we could come back to that one. Should we go? Do you want to go into the results? You had some questions. So I don't. You give the context of we're doing like a little experiment here, but give them the context. Is that they it way better than me.
Yeah. So the way that you can assess attachment, like you can do these quizzes, and when I work with people one-on-one and in groups, and I do this attachment work, this meditative attachment work, and it's what you do is you develop imaginary ideal parents, and then do the meditation practice is developing this experience as if you had parents who gave you all of these qualities, and you just receive consistent, attuned protection, expressed delight, and you imagine that, you imagine these parents doing that in all these different scenes, and there's a way that unfolds, like to work with the gaps that you might have, or your own different places where you're most stuck or reactive in relationships or in work or whatever it is. And you go back and imagine it. Really, to me, what's happening in that, because again, these are imaginary parents in your mind offering that to you. Really what's happening there is that's your own awareness. It's just you're going into like a receptive mode, but it's in you. You are developing these parents that can love like that perfectly, and you're receiving that love, basically. And that what's been shown over and over in the research is it's dramatically effective of shifting people's attachment patterns and strategies to more secure, more healthy, more effective, for greater connection, greater happiness, greater self-confidence and self-esteem. Like all of those things go up by doing this practice of imaginary parents over and over and over again. So that's what I do with people.
That's so, maybe it's like a little messed up in my head, not messed up, confused, because my parents are actually visiting, so they're upstairs, and so I'm just like, oh, imaginary. And I love my parents; they were incredible parents. But as I think of imaginary parents, I'm like, you're very different than the ones that I had.
Yeah, and I think that can be like, for some people, it's like can be great because it's like, yeah, my parents clearly had these huge gaps, and so like this is great. But for many people, your parents were like kind of good enough, and yet there's still like gaps. And so that's like what we can talk about in your assessment. There's still these gaps that you it's like you're filling in the gaps, the weaknesses in your own awareness and like building that skill and quality in yourself through
Yeah.
this imaginary. And the idea that nobody is an ideal parent. Like I'm aware,
Yeah.
as much as I like focus on this day in, day out, I'm totally aware I'm not that for my son. And he could do ideal parent meditation when he's ready.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the practice. And then you can do a similar thing with partners. That's the secure intimacy. It's like
Wow.
similarly imagining your partner able to give you this and you to them. And it's unbelievable. And I've done that a lot actually with work people. So I just want to say a lot of times, like you said, like attachment's like dating. But
Yeah.
it is like that's an important place it shows up, but it shows up in all our social relationships. So how you are at work, your bosses, the people that work underneath you, like all of it. And that's actually where I did most of my imagined work was with colleagues. And it really transformed our relationships.
Because Lisa and I have done different therapy types, different experiences, psychedelics, guided psychedelics. But one of the things that we realized, and it kind of comes full circle to this conversation, is that, and we'll probably talk about this, but like my tendency is to like go inwards and to just like close myself off to the world. And it's just like, I don't need anyone but myself. That's how I keep myself safe. And hers is the opposite, which is like, I need you to tell me that I'll be safe. I need you to hold me and to make me feel safe. I'm so scared of being alone. And so whenever we would have some kind of conflict, we would just like immediately go to our default patterning and needs, which was like running in in the moment where we needed to run closest to one another, we would run away from each other emotionally because of this emotional constitution, which we know came from like childhood, right? So it's just like fascinating to see it all just like come full circle in so many different ways.
So I love that you just told that story because it jives with the results of this assessment of your quiz. And I was mentioning this right before we talked. So I asked you to do this. It's theattachmentproject.com, and they have a quiz on there that anyone can take. And so what I said was interesting to me is you actually come out as generally in the secure category, which is great. And that makes sense. Like, it seems like you're generally functional in your life and you have a longer term partnership and children. And so, these are often the qualities of someone who's generally in the secure category. And yet you're really you're very low on the anxiety scale, which is what we would call your wife, who's like needs wants you to care, that outward looking. You're extremely low. In fact, I've never seen someone as low. You're like at zero anxiety. But you're towards what is on the avoidance scale. So you're not super high. You're right on the edge of what being categorized in an avoidant or a dismissive category.
Got it.
And so it's what you just described is like a perfect snapshot of how someone with that strategy or pattern might behave. It's like turning inward, under stress, go in, I don't need anyone, I'm an island. Shutting down and going inward, basically. And so the practice for someone with that patterning, there's a few things. And like we could do this more detailed assessment to like understand more the nuances of how you're doing that and why you're doing that and some of the underlying conditioning. But one would see the possibility is that you're maybe on the emotional level, like potentially your parents were very like protective and they did a lot of like, they were good parents in that way, but maybe weren't as attuned to your emotional world as you needed consistently, or like tender and that kind of way with your emotional world, so that you learn like, okay, when I have emotions, I just have to rely on myself. I don't go to my parents to get, I don't go to someone else to take care of me. I have to figure out a different way. Okay, I'll go in. But actually, like, so often the dismissives can seem like, or avoidant, like, I'm fine. Life's great. I'm fine. Like, I'm good.
That's Lisa, my wife. She's like, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine.
Yeah, I'm fine. No problem. But it's actually, there's a kind of disconnection or inability to really like both feel it on the inside and like communicate it. So and some very often the pathway towards wholeness or fullness for someone with that avoidant pattern is through a kind of grief, like and touching into the grief and loss of not actually having been able to have the full expression and the full care for all of your emotions and your sadness and your whatever, maybe fear, anger, whatever emotions were kind of not really allowed or attended to.
Yeah.
Going through a process of like acknowledging that and like and the pain of that, the loss of that.
The loss that I never got to experience that as a child.
Yeah. And have that kind of fundamental needs met. So there is a kind of grief process and getting comfortable going through that grief. It's like through back into more full connection with your partner, your wife, and your children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, as you're saying that, I'm getting emotional just hearing that. The thing that comes to mind, again, my parents are literally upstairs, is my dad, like, they're both immigrants. So they're in the United States with no family, no friends. They're not poor. I mean, they're above the poverty line. But it's almost, and then at the same time, there's a genocide happening in their country, right? And so,
what country? Where are
Cambodia.
They from? Okay, wow.
So in the 70s. So there's no emotion in my childhood. It's like they don't show it. I remember my wife we had this. They would say things like "stop crying," which is funny because I think a lot of parents in the 80s would say "stop crying," and now Lisa, you can't tell a child to stop crying. Like that's not how it works, right? But I kind of view like "stop crying" was kind of like a metaphor for like my entire childhood, which is whatever you're feeling, don't feel it. And it's to the point the fact that you're using specifically the word grief, it's like, oh my God, I never got to, even now I say, I'm like, you've never had the opportunity to feel in your life. And, there have been a few times more recently, like feeling grief and feeling, but there is still this giant, I don't know, either it's like armor or like scab, or maybe they're the same thing, right? Scar tissue of this like inability. I remember seeing an old therapist or teacher, and I'm like, how do I learn how to feel? Like, I don't think I know. And also, I drank a lot for my whole adult life. So
makes a lot of sense.
Anytime then there was some kind of need to feel something, I would either go inward or drink, or usually do them at the same time. And it wasn't actually until very recently that I stopped drinking. And it's just kind of, I'm like, oh my God, I can see the world through, like a fog has been lifted. And I've been living adulthood with this kind of fog. And I don't know whether I was an alcoholic or not. I don't know the exact definition, but I drank a lot. And so I'm like, God, my entire adulthood was spent with this fog. And I'm like, what did I miss over the past 25 years?
Yeah. Yeah. That all makes a ton of sense. And the irony is like, you can't tell a kid to stop crying. That doesn't work. It's like, but in one way it did. Like some part of you learned, okay, I'm going to stop
crying.
I'm going to stop feeling. But of course, like that's like a protective pattern on top. Like that crying kid is still in there wanting to be attended to, soothed. In the attachment research, they call it unresolved loss or unresolved mourning that needs to be processed.
because one theme that comes up often in this podcast is kind of like middle-class parents. They did the best they could. They focused on education. There's a lot of this is a lot of like driven folks, high achieving, but it's kind of like high. And I'm kind of starting to see now, because I feel like I took a turn off that path over the past decade, like leaving that world of work, but also entering this other world of more introspection and contemplation. But a lot of them listen. They're like, well, my parents, they did their, you always hear my parents, they did their best. And I think we all believe that our parents did their best given what they had at the time. But there's a few things that have resonated, and maybe you see them in my thing. Is like, one is they believe in what I guess I'll call conditional self-worth or conditional love, which is basically people will only love you if you demonstrate to them that you're worthy of love. And I think, again, I'm going to speak for my little population, but like this achievement type feels very unworthy. And then their coping mechanism is through achievement. I would suspect too that this group of folks tends to be pretty good. I think it's part of why they're so good at corporate is because they can just like shut it down and be like, I'm just going to work. And I know that I get praise when I work, and you can be like yelling at my face, but I can just disassociate from my feelings. Probably because, like in my case, like you learned to do that when you were told to stop crying, when you were 3.
Yep.
And then in some weird ways, like then you get and then add the much bigger question, like, quote unquote, society is like, oh, great job. You're so, look at you. You can work so hard and all that. So I know I threw a lot out there, but I love to see it because, again, when we first talked about attachment styles and strategy, oh, this is a dating thing. And I'm like, oh, this is not a dating thing.
It's so much exactly about how you relate to your work and your sense of purpose and meaning and mattering. And I also just do want to say, like, we all come by this, like, so honestly, like our parents did too. There's some of the research shows like an 80% correlation of your attachment style to your grandmother's, to your mom's attachment style. So just as like, it's very consistently passed down. And if like, you think about your parent, I mean, oh my gosh, like coming from Cambodia at that time, like how unsafe would it be to, like, how does one even keep your heart open to feel your feelings in those conditions? Coming from Cambodia at that time, then coming to this country where you just need to make it work, and you need your kids to be safe. Like that's how they were trying to make you safe. It's like, of course.
Yeah.
And, now you are safe. They succeeded. You're safe and you're successful in your way. And so you don't need that protective mechanism. Like you can develop tools to actually go in and feel.
Yeah.
And by feeling, you'll be in deeper connection to your life.
Yeah. And so what, maybe we wrap with, I mean, we could talk for hours. We're going to have to get you to come back. Thank you. But this is just so moving, and I can't thank you enough. Let's say someone is like, I can relate to some of the things that you're saying. I'm interested, besides, hiring you or joining one of your programs. Where does one go from this point? Like, and I'm selfishly asking for myself.
Yeah, totally. There is a website and a podcast, the metagroup.org, METTA group.org. And they have this George Haas, and he has a lot of podcasts about the ideal parent work and like attachment in general. So there's like a lot of great resources there. There's also another podcast called The Therapist Uncensored. That's some great attachment. And Dan, my teacher Dan's on there. He passed away almost 2 years ago now, but he's on there. So you could just go and listen to those and get a better sense of them. And if you Google ideal parent protocol, you can find some recordings from Dan and some other people, and get in touch with me. I have some recordings as well. that you can. So like you can do the meditation. There's like a generic one for avoidant type, for
Oh, okay.
anxious type, for disorganized, and you can do the meditations on your own. And then also you can have the kind of like targeted practices with a coach, if you can
Gotcha.
go deep like that. Yeah.
Would this fall under the realm of like, I don't even, is this like a
Therapy.
type of therapy? Is it a type of or it's
Yeah.
hybrid?
Yeah. And so Dan was a therapist, and there's a lot of therapists doing it. And he co-wrote a book that's called Attachment Disturbances in Adults. Attachment Disturbances. It's a big tome. It's a long, and so if you really want to go deep, go there. It's awesome. So there are therapists, but Dan also trained, like I was trained by him in his masterclass. He trained meditation teachers because he really saw it as an intersection of meditation and therapy.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it is a form of therapy, but it also, you can go practice these meditations. And so I really, when I think about it, I put them into the love, that like
Got it.
loving kindness, compassion
Yeah.
category. So like days when I feel like I need the love practice, this will be something I'll do. I'll like imagine my ideal parents, and they're offering me these
Personal.
different qualities and helping soothe me, whatever's happening. That's like one of the
Got
kind of
it.
love practices that I'll do
Yeah.
if I need it. Yeah.
Got it. And for someone like me, that's like, I don't know if I've ever felt deeply in my life, would it be in that same kind of vein of like ideal parent type meditation?
Yeah. And you keep developing it. And then what's awesome, like knowing you have children, and just even how you've related in this conversation, and the feeling, like it's obvious, it's right there. Like,
Yeah.
and you as a father, like sometimes the father, the way that you feel about your kids is your doorway in. You turn that back to yourself.
Yeah.
So we find the access points that are in everyone,
Yeah.
because the suggestion is that is the nature of our awareness. It's just been covered
Yeah.
over. So it's there. Yeah.
Beautiful. Jess, like I said, I feel this lightness. I feel, I knew that we were, I'm laughing at myself. I'm like, isn't this about dating? You know, like, and I'm like, oh my God, this is, you're talking about genocide and
Yeah.
not you're talking about, like that there's
Yeah.
a pathway through genocide and feelings and Wall Street and so on. But what I love, like for me, I've been, like I said, a tourist of contemplative. I've worked with different teachers, and as I was sharing with you earlier, when I listen, and I'll put the podcast where you tell your story. I mean, we did it no justice with the 3-minute. But I was just, I was so moved by there's a pragmatism, which is like, yeah, we have jobs and we have kids and we have phones and all that. But at the same time, there's this real harmony with these ancient traditions that are with us. And then you like layer in the psychology kind of pieces of it. It's just it really lands for me, because I think if I just took one of them in isolation, if it's just like, oh, it's just contemplation, I don't think it would have the salience at this point in my life to like really rope me in. Right. Just like I needed
Beautiful.
TM
Yeah.
to be like, it's going to make you less stressed. I'm like, cool, sign me up for less stress. But like really, it was the gateway drug for a much, much deeper set of things. So I know that many of our listeners are maybe even in earlier phases of whatever that kind of discovery is than me. And so to kind of hear it through, from downstream from you to them it's truly a gift. And I really, this is the last podcast we're recording of the year. So I'm like, what a amazing note to finish on. So I thank you for that, Jess.
Thank you so much. It's like, it's really sweet. It's so sweet to get to know you a little bit more, and I appreciate your questions and your authenticity, vulnerability. Yeah.
Thank you. Where, if our listeners want to learn more about you, we'll put it all in the show notes as well. But where's the best place for them to find you?
Great. My website is jessicamori.org. Jessica Morey, Morey. Yep, .org. And then I have various things on there that you can listen to and sign up for the newsletter. I am extremely sporadic with my newsletter, but when I'm doing something, I'll spread the word. And I'm actually going to be doing some more group attachment coaching. So if that's something you're interested in the new year, I'm going to start.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we'll share that with
Mhm.
our community, because I know I'm interested, and I know that people will resonate with many of the things that you shared and will want to do more. So
Great.
thank you so
Awesome.
much, Jess.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me, for your beautiful questions. Yeah.
Take care.